Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Conservationists Assemble podcast, a show that seeks to unite Earth's mightiest advocates in a mission to ensure a future for our planet's incredible habitats and its awesome inhabitants. I am your host, Johnny Bloxham, and coming up, we'll be putting the spotlight on the world's smallest species of rhino. For this episode, we are taking our first trip to the island of Sumatra, where we've been joined by our expert guest to discuss the conservation of this species and the crucial work of zoos in laying a foundation for their wild future. Join the podcast and our expert guest, Stacy Strother, as we talk about the Sumatran rhino's closest rhino relative and the incredible work of the Cincinnati Zoo in Ohio and the International Rhino Foundation in contributing to ensuring a future for these awesome animals. Please welcome Stacy as she joins the ranks of the Conservationists Assemble initiative and shares her stories, expertise and passion for rhinos. Stacy, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. How's it going?
It's going great. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, and you're most welcome. I'm happy to hear that you're doing well, and obviously we're here to talk about the Sumatran Rhino and International Rhino Foundation. So first off, could you tell us a little bit about Sumatran rhinos?
Yeah, Sumatran rhinos are they're one of the most endangered land mammals that are left on the planet. They're one of the oldest rhino species, so they're most closely related to the woolly rhino, actually, and that makes them really unique because they're also known as the hairy rhino. So they're much hairier than any of the other rhino species. They live now just in Indonesia. They used to live all throughout Southeast Asia, but they're also the smallest rhino species. So they're probably about half the height of your standard white rhino or greater one-horn rhino. They are just amazing creatures.
Oh wow, I didn't realise they were that small. I was kind of aware that they were smaller than African species of rhino, but when you still see a picture of a Sumatran rhino, they still can be perceived as quite large.
Yeah. The proportions are kind of hard to tell, but they're quite short.
Oh, that makes them. It must make them even more endearing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, in terms of why we're talking about them today, obviously we've already kind of touched on how their home range is a lot smaller than it used to be historically. But what classification do we have for the Sumatran rhino, and what is their population trend?
Sure. So Sumatran rhinos are classified as critically endangered, and they've been classified that way for a long time. And that's an IUCN Red List classification, and essentially that means they're one step away from extinction or extinction in the wild. And without heavy intervention like they're receiving, they would more than likely go extinct. And that's what critically endangered means. So I know a lot of times the word endangered gets thrown around and maybe even overused a
Mm.
lot these days. But these guys really are one of the most endangered mammals on the planet. Um, so the government of Indonesia, they have a count and they estimate there's still somewhere fewer than 80 Sumatran rhinos, which is not a lot. The IUCN Asian Rhino Specialist Group has kind of done a survey, and their study most recently indicates there's probably 34 to 47. So either way, whether it's 30 rhinos or 80 rhinos, it's not a lot. The main problem is that we just don't know for sure. We know that they're disappearing. They're going into kind of smaller and smaller pockets deep in the jungles. They're isolating more and more. So we're not seeing them as much as we used to even 10 years ago, which is pretty concerning.
Yeah, really concerning. And I suppose when we've touched on actually, they're a lot smaller than maybe we are aware of, and then yeah, you're in the middle of the dense jungle. It's probably not hard for them to slip by.
Oh, absolutely. You can be standing 10 feet away from a Sumatran rhino and not even know it because the jungle is so dense and they're fairly small. relative. So, and they're an elusive species for years. That's kind of how they evolved to be stealthy and go unnoticed. So they do really good at that as well, which makes our job a lot harder.
Yeah, and I suppose obviously 80 is not a big number, 30 certainly not a big number, but irrespective of which one of those, that it means that there's not a lot of room for error.
Absolutely, absolutely. So every single Sumatran rhino is important. Every single piece of research is really important, and there's so many people around the world really dedicated. Of course, there are a lot of people and organizations in Indonesia focused on them, but really this is kind of an around the clock. And Sumatran rhinos conservation, really it started about 40 years ago, where people have started really looking at, hey, the species is in trouble, and they've kind of been slowly slipping through our fingers. And part of that is because of their natural behavior. But yeah, it's been going on for a long time, and there are a lot of people dedicated to helping them.
That's really great to hear, and we're definitely going to try and put the spotlight on those actions soon. And I'm really glad that you've brought up the government side of things. It's great to hear that there is some government involvement. But in terms of kind of raising the awareness and understanding the threats to the Sumatran rhino, when we talk about rhino conservation, it's actually one of the easier ones to talk about when you talk about their African cousins, because it's very well documented. And if you talk about white rhinos to the least animal-minded person, they're still kind of exposed to understanding what's going on there. So how can we compare what's happening with Sumatran rhinos to that of their African counterparts, and how can we get the awareness for Sumatran rhinos to that same level?
Oh, sure. Yeah. That's a really good question, because yeah, absolutely, you're right. When people hear about rhinos, African rhinos are probably the first thing that pops into your mind. A lot of people don't even know that there are Asian rhino species, that there's actually 5 species of rhinos, and 3 of them live in Asia. 2 of them only live in Indonesia, which is where the Sumatran rhino is, and then also the Javan rhino that lives there. So yeah, I think it has a lot to do with numbers and visibility. But also, if you go to your local zoo, more than likely, if there's a rhino there, it's a white rhino or a black rhino from Africa, maybe a greater one-horn rhino from the India Nepal region. So that visibility, and physically being able to see those animals, that certainly helps them. But I would say, we often say in the zoo world that the animals that are at the zoo are kind of ambassadors for their wild counterparts. And I would say that has to be the same case for those rhino species that are in zoos. They can be kind of ambassadors for the Javan and Sumatran rhinos, who you won't see at zoos. And I think that's really important for people to understand, is that conservation for one species a lot of times really has a ripple effect, and it helps so many other species.
Yeah, and I suppose now it's an appropriate time to mention that there aren't any Sumatran or Javan rhinos in zoos globally, and certainly in the Sumatran rhinos case, that's actually a quite a recent thing. So yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about how we, as zoos, can continue to kind of change the needle, or do our bit for Sumatran rhinos despite them not being viewable?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I do have to say that zoos are a huge part of where we're at today with Sumatran rhinos. There's so much that we wouldn't know about them. And frankly, we wouldn't have as many Sumatran rhinos on the planet today if it weren't for the work that so many zoos did. So in the early 90s is kind of when a lot of these rhinos, they started to look at ex situ breeding programs for them. So a lot of them were captured, sent to zoos around the world, some in Europe, some in the US. And essentially what resulted from that was the first Sumatran rhinos born in captivity anywhere, and that was at Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens. It turns out that, not only are these really behaviorally elusive species, but their reproductive system is totally different from any other rhino species. So figuring that out took a really long time. Dr. Terry Roth and her team at the Cincinnati Zoo really kind of cracked that nut. They had Andalas born in 2001, and then they had another rhino born in 2004, Suchi, and then Harapan in 2007. So they had 3 births there at the Cincinnati Zoo. Andalas and Harapan now live at the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary in Wakambas in Indonesia. So that was a huge endeavor in itself to send those rhinos overseas to be part of that breeding program. Because by then it became clear in 2007 that there wasn't a sustainable breeding program outside of Indonesia. It would take sending more animals from Indonesia over to the US. And at that point, in 2012, they had kind of their own success with Undatu born at the SRS. So that was huge and just gave everyone really big hope. Any scientist, you want to be able to replicate the results, right? So it was really great that they had rhinos born in Cincinnati. They want to see, can they have them born somewhere else? So now that breeding program is going really strong. And there are 10 animals at the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary, which if you think about it, that could be up to represent a third of the wild population. So that's pretty significant. So all of that to say, without the work of zoos, a lot of those animals at the SRS wouldn't exist today. So it's been a really amazing the history of the partnership. It's really been a global effort. And now that these species only exist in Indonesia, they're really kind of taking charge, and they take that very seriously. These animals now only live in this country. So yeah, it's been amazing. And as far as what zoos can keep doing today is to keep talking about Sumatran rhinos. I know it's hard because they're not standing right behind you, but again, you can use the rhino species that you do have as a jumping off point to have conversations about the little rhino species that there just aren't enough of in the world.
Absolutely, and yeah, I think it's something certainly to be very proud of, and almost everyone would want to shout about at any given opportunity because it is a huge success, and I suppose a lot of what we're seeing in the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary is almost replicative of what we've done in zoos. So it shows that impact in that form as well.
100%. Yeah, that's kind of the point that we're at with them now in conservation, because we know so little about what's going on with them in the wild. They're disappearing and we're not 100% sure why. We know a lot of it. They were, years ago, they were poached down to such small numbers. I think they kind of reached a tipping point where now, even though we don't think there's any more poaching going on, partly because they're so hard to find, they're down to such small numbers that the little pockets that they're in, they just can't reproduce enough to keep their population sustainable and going. So, it's very likely that Sumatran rhinos as a species, they're going to be dependent on a captive breeding program, just like with the California condor or black-footed ferret here that happened in the US. The main difference is that rhinos, of course, take up a lot more room.
Yes.
Even though they're small rhino species, these guys are pretty territorial, so it's not like we can even throw all 10 of them together in a pen. They have to have a lot of space and their own space, which has been part of the success there. Their habitat there at the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary, we call it semi-wild because it's literally just pens kind of created in their wild natural habitat. They live out there for most of the day and they're browsing on all of the natural plants that they would be eating in the wild. So yeah, it's a pretty amazing facility, and because of the success of that program, that's going to be what carries the species going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, can you then talk to us a bit more about the government aid? Obviously, you've mentioned that the government in Indonesia have maybe their idea of the population in the wild, but what other things are the government doing to help ensure the species survival?
Yeah, so they kind of drive and lead all of the conservation plans for all of their species. So they have action plans and they lead the strategies, and then the local nonprofit organizations, and then us overseas, we can kind of help fill in the gaps wherever they need. So we can provide kind of the awareness support, of course, funding support is really helpful, any expertise. We work with a lot of really great local nonprofits, and that's something that the International Rhino Foundation, we really pride ourselves on, is supporting and developing the local organizations in rhino range countries that are, you know, they live there, they live in those communities, they live in those environments, and they know those species and the communities best. And that's really important because the local communities are critical, absolutely critical, to bolstering and stewarding these species. We can't do it from over here remotely by shaking a finger and telling people what to do. It's really about supporting the people who are doing the good work, and kind of connecting those dots between the organizations as well, and lending support where we can.
Yeah, it's absolutely something I'm learning through doing this. Conversations with organisations is that everyone has said the local communities and the local NGOs are some of the most crucial elements of conservation. So yeah, could you maybe just tell us some of the local NGOs that are in Sumatra that we should be talking about?
Sure, sure. So we work with Yayasan Badak Indonesia, and they are the ones who actually manage the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary, and they also have rhino protection units as well. So the rhino protection units are rangers. They're highly trained four-person teams that go out and they're patrolling the jungles every single day of the year, in areas where rhinos live. So that's both for Javan and Sumatran rhinos. So those animals kind of get round the clock protection. But they're also doing community work, right? So they're also educating the community, hopefully trying to get information to keep poachers or other illegal hunters out of the national parks. A lot of what happens is it's people coming into the national parks for sustenance hunting, for bushmeat hunting, things like that. Even songbirds, for that pet trade. So it's not necessarily people coming into these places for rhinos, but they're still coming in to do illegal activities. So the rhino protection units are really critical in helping educate people, keep them out of the forest. But then addition, it's also working with communities and providing opportunities for alternative livelihoods and different food sources, so they don't have to come into the national parks for those resources.
We've obviously touched on how the IRF is a component in funding and raising awareness. So could you tell us about the background of the IRF and its foundation?
Yeah. So the International Rhino Foundation, we actually started as the International Black Rhino Foundation in the 90s. So again, this came out of the late 80s. Poaching for black rhinos specifically was getting really, really bad. And it became really clear that looks like there needs to be intervention. And in Zimbabwe specifically, um, the rhino populations there were in serious trouble. So the initial effort there was getting those animals, removing those animals out of that really unsafe area. And a lot of them were brought to the US. So nowadays, we've kind of obviously expanded to all 5 species. It didn't take long for that. In 93, we changed to International Rhino Foundation, so all 5 species. Um, and it's been really amazing because each rhino species has its own very unique set of challenges. They live in different parts of the world. Each country that has these rhinos, they have a different kind of opinion and way to manage them, but we can kind of help connect those dots, and um, there's been a lot of learning. The International Rhino Foundation is a science-based organization, which means that we change our strategies and tactics kind of when the best available information comes up. So we've worked in a lot of different countries. We work in places that's really difficult to work in, that people don't necessarily want to work in. It's because it can be challenging. But we kind of do the harder work that isn't necessarily always flashy. A lot of times it's the very like the boring kind of critical stuff. But it's really important. So, an example of that is for translocations. So if a rhino gets moved from one area to another, there's actually a lot of work before that, before anyone ever touches a rhino. And that's the kind of stuff that we help with, is feasibility studies, to see, where best locations are for rhinos to move to, and logistics for how to get them there and things like that. So we have an amazing network of rhino partners all around the world. And we're so lucky to get to work with such dedicated people everywhere.
Yeah, and thank you for kind of giving us that insight and highlighting that the partners that are maybe behind the scenes could come in all forms, from other NGOs to corporate to zoos as well. So in terms of funding, regardless of whether it's coming from zoos or corporate or kind of other means or public donations, obviously incredibly important. What does that funding do?
Yeah, so that funding does a lot of different things. So our big focus areas obviously are direct rhino management and protection. Habitat management is another huge one, because that's behind poaching. Habitat management, having enough habitat and having enough quality habitat, is kind of the next big issue for a lot of rhino species. And then, as we mentioned, in engaging people. So community development, capacity building for rhino conservationists in range countries. There are a lot of people in the world who want to dedicate their lives to rhinos, and we want to help them do that. So on the rhino management side, it's everything from research to translocations, direct protection. Security is huge. I'm sure you're aware, and your listeners are aware, that poaching really is kind of a game of leapfrog a lot of times between these poaching syndicates, who are really heavily funded and controlled by international criminal syndicates. So there are really big players kind of at the top of that scheme, who are funding these poaching operations. So counteracting that with technology, you kind of have to keep trying to be 2 steps ahead of poaching. So there's a lot of security and technology there. And then, moving animals, if animals need to be moved. Rhino translocations can be pretty expensive. And even just monitoring them. So a lot of these key populations, we support Low-Veld Rhino Trust in Zimbabwe, who monitors really heavily their black rhino population there. And, just as a zookeeper might, you would go out and you would do rounds and you would check all your individual animals. They kind of have a similar system there, obviously on a much larger scale, but they know every single rhino who lives in their area. And by knowing their animals and knowing when, hey, there's something off with this one, or I haven't seen this particular animal in a few weeks, that can really lead them to intervening before there's a big issue. So if there's a medical issue, or if there happens to be a poaching attempt, they can really address that really quickly. So our funds go a lot of different places all around the world, to a lot of different things. For rhinos, every tool in the toolbox is something that needs to be explored.
And then now looking at the future, what actions need to happen to keep the ball rolling for Sumatran rhino conservation?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of time and patience, and a lot of times, it's rhinos are challenging because nothing really happens quickly with rhinos, unfortunately, unless you're talking about poaching, and that's why poaching can be so devastating because rhino populations take a really long time to recover, right? They have about a 16-month gestation period, and the calves stay with moms for a significant amount of time. So it can be 3 to 4 years in between calves. So, a rhino has one calf every 3 to 4 years. That can be a really slow growing population. So, a lot of it is just is a matter of time. But of course, as these programs um, get larger. So the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary, I mentioned now there were 2 births last year, which is so exciting. But that now brings the capacity of the sanctuary to pretty much full. They're at capacity now, so they're going to need to expand. So as this breeding program expands, that's going to take a lot more money and resources as well.
And I think that's given us a really lovely insight into where we are currently with the status of Sumatran rhinos. So we're now just going to kind of take the seriousness down a bit and want to know what Sumatran rhinos mean to you. So what is your favorite thing about Sumatran rhinos?
I mean, I think, to kind of keep on the seriousness a bit, they're, they're kind of the most daunting challenge that we have as rhino conservationists. But at the same time, when I think of Sumatran rhinos, I think of hope. They really represent um, what the potential for, you know, global conservation breeding management can be. They represent so much collaboration to me. And humans are the problem a lot of times with a lot of these animals, especially rhinos. But humans can also be the solution. So Sumatran rhinos do really represent hope to me. When I think of them, I think of them in the future, and it's we might not be able to control what happens to them in the wild, but there's still really a chance for them. We've seen it happen with plenty of other rhino species, and plenty of other species around the world. So I think that's what I like most about them is maybe they're a little bit of an underdog,
Hmm.
um, where it seems like there's a huge uphill battle for them right now. But I think that, in 100 years, people will be kind of looking back on this time period, as we're doing now, and they'll be saying this was kind of the moment in Sumatran rhino history where everything really changed and it really changed course. So that's kind of what I hope.
No, and yeah, I'm glad that yeah, even though we want to, acknowledge that conservation is a heavy topic and it's worth keeping the light-hearted moments for such a time. I'm glad that you kind of kept your foot on the pedal for that note because it was a very apt point, and I think, yeah, hopefully we will be looking back in 100 years and be like, yeah,
Yeah, I like
that's
to
where the
think so.
tables turned.
Yeah.
So, what was your first experience with Sumatran rhinos?
My first time I remember pretty well. So Harapan was the first Sumatran rhino I met, and I'd mentioned so Harapan lived at was born at the Cincinnati Zoo, and he actually moved around the US a little bit to make room there so that they could in Cincinnati so that they could keep breeding their rhinos. And so Harapan went and lived at a facility in Florida called White Oak Conservation for a few years. And I was a zookeeper at the time, and I started volunteering at White Oak Conservation Center. I was a rhino keeper, and I had only worked with white rhinos at the time, and I wanted to learn more about all the rhino species. So I was lucky enough. They were, within a 3-hour drive of me, and they had four of the five rhino species at
Wow.
that time. So it was just I was like, what an amazing opportunity. So, I would work 40 hours a week as a zookeeper and then drive up 3 hours on the weekend to work there, to volunteer there as a zookeeper. But I remember the first time I met Harapan, and I was just so amazed. I didn't realize how small they were, how much shorter they were than other rhinos. And he was still fairly young then, so just so hairy. I mean, really furry, and they have these big goofy ears and this really bulbous nose. He just looked like a Muppet to me. I was just, jaw agape, just wide-eyed. I just kind of couldn't believe what I was seeing. I'd never seen an animal like that before. So yeah, and he was just as sweet as can be, and they would just walk right in with him and feed him his food, and they can be pretty docile. But yeah, it was kind of just an amazing experience. And I know a lot of people in the US got to meet Harapan, and I think he's kind of a fan favorite over here because the experience is so rare. So
Hmm.
yeah, so I definitely remember my first time seeing one, and it was pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I get what you mean about him being kind of a celebrity in the sense that I mean he did. I wouldn't put. I'm not going to speak for the whole of UK zookeeping scene, but I know in our kind of conversation back and forth before today, I was aware of Harapan, not necessarily by name, but I was aware that there was a kind of a Sumatran rhino at Cincinnati Zoo, and so it just shows you the role that he is playing.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one rhino, and I think that's a really great lesson too. Just one rhino can really make a difference and be a big advocate for rhinos in general.
And I'm also glad that you mentioned obviously your kind of time volunteering with him and obviously your background as a zookeeper because yeah, we kind of want to move on to how you got to where you are in your career at this moment. So yeah, could you just give us a little bit more of detail into to your journey into zookeeping and now onwards to where you are now?
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's been a lot of hard work and a lot of luck being in right place, right time, and being open to things. I came into zookeeping. I studied psychology in college. I got really interested in behavior analysis and training animals for research purposes. So, pigeons in the Skinner boxes pecking at keys. So I found that really interesting in training animals for behavioral studies. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my career, I was, well, how do I apply that? And as a little kid, I had always thought like, oh, I'll be a zookeeper one day. And that seems maybe less realistic the older you get. But then I kind of thought about it and I was like, well, can I apply kind of these training ideas and methodologies? You can do a lot for zoo animals. And I loved the idea of medical management training for husbandry purposes. And I think that was really big coming up, and more, I think maybe a lot of people don't realize with zoos these days how much time and effort is put into animal welfare and animal well-being. And you can train a lot of animals to do a lot of different things, even if it's something as simple as getting a weight on your hoofstock animals, which, as you know, hoofstock are one of the hardest because they're prey animals and
Yeah.
they're afraid of you.
Yeah.
They think everyone is trying to eat them. So those can be really hard, difficult animals to train. So I got really interested in just training and animal behavior of all animals, and that's what kind of got me into zoos. And then kind of as I was going through my zoo career and especially working with rhinos, one of my first jobs, and one of my first kind of as I had just been learning the rhino area, we had a few rhinos that needed to move, and so I got to help with their crate training process. So through training rhinos to go into a crate and closing them in a crate, and that crate gets lifted onto a truck, just seeing that whole process just really got me interested in them. And then of course I was working with rhinos during the height of the rhino poaching crisis, kind of in 2012 through 2015. And it really kind of dawned on me that the animals here aren't my biggest concern. These animals are, more than well taken care of. They're spoiled rotten. An animal sneezes and someone notes it, and you're watching and observing. So it was really the animals in the wild. And I think just having to it's so hard to fathom how, when you care about your rhinos so much, how someone can kill them for their horn. So that's kind of where I thought, my focus needed to shift. I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do, but I went back to school. I did my master's in environmental law and policy. Again, not really sure, but I wanted to put myself in a position where I could get more involved, either in the wildlife side of things here, either with like a federal wildlife program or in something in the nonprofit world. And when an internship from International Rhino Foundation popped up one summer, and I applied for it, and the rest is history. I've been with them for 5 years now, which is absolutely amazing because they were kind of my dream organization, my goal organization. So I thought it would take a long time to get to this point. Let me build up a bunch of nonprofit skills that will be marketable, and I can eventually get a job somewhere like International Rhino Foundation. But yeah, that's kind of the luck part, as far as timing. But I definitely took a lot of chances and created more doors so that they could be open to me and I can run through them when I had the chance.
Amazing. And now, what kind of networking or achievements and experiences would you say your time with the International Rhino Foundation has enabled for you?
Um, Again, as someone who was a rhino fan and rhino conservation fan before, just the getting to be in the same room as some of these rhino conservationists who I've admired for a long time. Um, and a lot of times it's not even physically the same room, it's a Zoom room. But even that, or and I've gotten the privilege to have such great conversations with them. I've had the privilege to go to Indonesia, to the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary several times, and talk to the rhino protection units and to the keeper staff at the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary. And it's just It's so amazing. Uh, and I'm a little bit at, at loss for words, honestly, on it. I get so yeah, almost starstruck
Hmm.
at a lot of the people that I get to meet, and I'm just so amazed at the dedication of everyone for a lot of these species. And I think that's something it feels um, you feel really connected to those people, to even strangers. We're all rhino people are some of the most passionate, stubborn, some of the passionate people in the world. And I think, I think we're similar to the animals that we're most drawn to. But yeah, it's amazing this connection that you can form, whether it's a rhino keeper here in the US or whether it's a rhino keeper in Indonesia. There's this underlying, sense of responsibility for our planet's biodiversity and our planet's some of the most fascinating species we have on this planet. So it's been incredible.
Yeah, yeah, it absolutely sounds just you can see what it means to you or hear what it means to you in just kind of you retelling it now. So yeah, I'd like to. When was your first time in Sumatra, and kind of what was going through your head as you kind of stepped off the plane and what was about to unfold?
Yeah, so I've kind of had, I don't know, maybe a travel fear, I guess, or it's always seemed really daunting to me. And then plus being a zookeeper, you don't necessarily have a lot of resources to go on these big international trips yourself. So that flight to Indonesia was my first international flight. That was my first big trip. So Indonesia is a doozy, but it's a long time to get there. But just um, you know, it really surprised me. Again, I think knowing I didn't think that I was going there to be impressed by the people. Or let me say that again. When I went to Indonesia, I thought, this was going to be about rhinos and
Hmm.
conservation for me and the wild spaces. And that was going to be the most impressive part of the trip. The most impressive part of the trip, hands down, was the people. And again, um, even though we didn't speak the same language a lot of times, there's still this connection, I think, especially between keepers and rhino protection units, even. We're on the front lines. We're the ones who are the closest to these animals and closest to the situation. And a lot of that pressure gets put on us too. We're the ones we have to be the biggest advocates for those animals. And so there's this underlying commonality. And that was what I didn't expect going to Indonesia is how similar we really all are. And again, not being, I think most zookeepers, they would say, I'm an animal person, not a people
Yeah.
person. Same, but man, that's what being in the conservation world has really taught me is conservation is absolutely about the people.
No, so yeah, thank you so much for sharing because I think it is something that does probably get lost a little bit in translation. So yeah, I think that's a great point to finish up kind of a look into your career and what your role has enabled you to do. So we're just going to finish the episode with some quick fire questions before we let you get back to doing what you enjoy doing. So Stacey, are there any dream species that you'd love to see in the wild?
Anything African. So I haven't been to Africa yet in my travels, as I had mentioned, zookeeper life. But yes, I'm no longer afraid of travel. It no longer seems daunting to me. So that'll be happening for me, I'm sure. So I would say, of course, white rhinos. They were my favorite. I'd love to see some southern ground hornbills, Rupel's griffon vultures. Okapi would be super cool, but
Yeah.
again, that's one of those species probably not not going to see in the wild. But yeah, uh, maybe kudu,
Yeah.
greater kudu. I just think any of those large livestock species in Africa would be amazing to see.
Yeah, certainly some fantastic species there. So fingers crossed for you that you
Yeah.
have some success there. If you could be an animal, Stacey, what animal would it be and why?
Um, Honestly, I would say and I think the best animal in the world, hands down, are dogs. So as much as I love rhinos, I still think the best animal in the world, are dogs, and I would absolutely want to be, my dog, or, but yeah, they get pretty spoiled. I'm pretty jealous of them. They don't have to worry about what's going on in the world, or anything like that. They have it pretty easy.
Yeah.
So I get pretty jealous of them. They don't
Yeah.
have a lot of stress in their life.
No, they certainly don't. I can see the appeal. So when you're not working and when you're not spoiling your dog, how do you keep busy?
Oh man, I mean that's kind of it, right? I think
Yeah.
for zookeeping and conservation, it's a lifestyle, right? It's not just a job. So it's kind of your hobbies kind of bleed into your day to day as well. But yeah, I try to enjoy life,
Hmm.
enjoy friends and rhino keepers and others, and my coworkers, my amazing team that's both here in the US and all around the world. I just try to enjoy life as much as possible and live in the moment. I think that's really important because we don't know what's happening in the future. So
No. Yeah, absolutely great. Can get on board with that. Last two then. How can our listeners keep up to date with the work of the International Rhino Foundation?
yeah, our website, rhinos.org, is a great place to do that. Of course, our social media sites. On our website, you can subscribe to our newsletter that we send out every month. So there we'll give you updates on all the programs from around the world, and including from Sumatra. So yeah, that's a great way to stay in touch with rhino news and all the latest that's going on.
And lastly, then, what do you think is one, if there is just one key thing that our listeners should take away from today's episode?
Yeah, one key thing is rhinos need help. And absolutely anybody can be a part of helping them. They can be a part of rhino stories. It's the smallest action. And for zookeepers especially, you guys have a really important gift. You have a really unique opportunity where you get to talk to the public every day, and you have the best prop. You have a live rhino standing behind you, hopefully, or whatever the species are that you're working with. So that's an amazing opportunity to get people's attention and get a point across about conservation, because it's maybe a little bit more impressive to see a live rhino than it is maybe to read an article or something like that. You've got a really unique opportunity there talking about rhinos, and all it takes is planting one little seed. Most of the people we talk to, how they got into rhino conservation, or some of our donors or partners, a lot of that experience, it started by visiting the rhinos at their local zoo. So it's a really amazing kind of seed that everyone can kind of plant now. And we're going to be growing the next generation of rhino conservationists, and that's really what we need all hands on deck, as many people loving rhinos as possible.
A fantastic point to finish up on there, Stacey. So a massive shout out to you for giving your time, knowledge and passion on not just Sumatran rhinos, but clearly just animals in general. So thank you so much for joining the podcast today. We'll be sure to keep up to date with all of the work surrounding the Sumatran rhinos and the International Rhino Foundation. And of course, we wish you all of the best in your career going forward too.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you, Johnny. Thank you for the work that you're doing with your podcast and spreading the word for a lot of species. It's great.
A massive thank you to Stacey once again for all her hard work in conservation and her time on the Conservationists Assemble podcast today. But as always, a huge thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the show. If you did enjoy this episode, please like, share and review or rate the podcast, as it helps us to keep improving and spreading the word on the conservation efforts taking place around the world. Don't forget that you can always follow and interact with the podcast on Instagram, Facebook or via email. I've been your host, Johnny Bloxham, and I hope to see you all next time.